Hi everyone, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting some Infernus Marines and we're doing them up as the Raptors Chapter. So a nice forest green with these guys, and I'll show you at the end how I did the sort of foresty jungle bases as well. So what I've done initially was just built the models. These are the push fit models, and I've kept his head separate because we're doing some airbrushing around the neck area. I base coated the models in black primer and then did another base coat using AK dark green, which will give us our darkest green tone, because what we're going to be doing with the Vallejo olive drab is through the airbrush we're going to be doing a sort of zenithal highlight where we're going to be primarily spraying downwards across the top of the model with the olive drab colour, so that we catch all the leading edges and top parts and the flat areas, but we leave that black green in the deepest recesses and in the shadows. So the primary goal here is that we're imagining the sunlight is coming over from the sort of top left, but because these are on the tabletop and not display miniatures, I will be adding some highlights underneath and in some areas where I just think it will just naturally catch the eye anyway, and that would be a little bit brighter. So the idea here is to just work around the model and doing these downward facing highlights. You could do this with a dry brush. We'd use a sort of soft round headed dry brush and work it sort of downwards, not upwards, just downwards across the miniature to get that smooth transition. You might also have to just run a little bit of thinned down sort of Athonian camo shade over the top once you've done that dry brushing, just so that help blends in. You could of course do some recess shading with this afterwards, but where we were doing that downward zenithal highlight, I don't think there was much point. As a final highlight, I use some AK Pistachio, which is a very yellow green, and I just do a couple of sprays just on the mainly on the top part of the miniature where I was expecting the most sunlight to be bouncing back. It looks quite yellow when we first put it on, but it does dry back with a slight greenness to it, and I said this is a very subtle final highlight and just add some nice definition to our model. And here we are, I'm just showing you how I did it on the whole of the squad. So I'm painting the entire squad during this tutorial, focusing really for the tutorial on the sergeant because we've got some airbrushing stuff, but obviously everything we do on the sergeant is applicable on all the other models. Once we've finished with this airbrushing stage, we're then just going to move on to just doing some blocking in, which I didn't capture on the camera because there's no real point. All I've done is anything that's not armour, I've just gone back over that with the AK Army Painter, sorry not AK, the Army Painter's matte black, which was the same sort of tone as we done with the primer, but any just black to bring it back to a base coat. Now I'm going to paint in all of the metal areas. For that I'm using AK gunmetal, which is a nice dark metallic area. Now, looking at the standard chapter colours with these guys, they did have green around the trim of the armour panels. I didn't kind of like that. I sometimes like the armour panels to stand out, and I saw on Space Marine 2 someone designed a Raptors colour scheme, and they had silver on the trim. I thought it looked really good, so I'm painting the trim on the armour panels on his shoulders in the silver. But the idea is just to go around, just carefully painting all of your silver areas. for the flamer, we're going to be doing that a brass colour. So the first colour I use is the Warhammer Bronze Scorpion, and we just do a single coat. Actually, I did 2 coats of this because I did thin it down a little bit. So 2 coats of this over the black. To get some sort of burn, wear and tear on the gun, I've got some AK Tenebrous Grey and I've watered it down. You could use Corvus Black or any just cold black colour. Baden Black is okay, but it's sort of a not quite black. So Tenebrous Grey is really good because it's got a slight purplish hint to it, but it dries kind of dusty and dirty. So what I'm doing here is I'm using watered down Tenebrous Grey as my black wash, really, instead of like Nuln Oil. I just wanted to get that dirty, dusty look with it, but you could use Nuln Oil. So all I'm doing here is carefully with a wash going over all of the silver areas. And then I also use this wash on the brass section of the Infernus flamer. And what I do with wash, like any wash where you leave your brush, the most paint is left. So I put the paint at the top of the gun closest to the model and then drag the paint towards the end, so it's getting more worn the further away from the marine, so closer to where the flame actually comes out is where I want it to be most worn, and sort of soot deposits left there. So to get that, really I did probably 4 or 5 layers of the watered down Tenebrous Grey, working smaller and smaller sections. So the first couple was the whole of the gun, then the next one was about halfway, and then about a quarter of the way, and then at the very end with some. And so what you do is you get a nice gradient of that Tenebrous Grey wash going from a little bit to a lot, so it just shows some heat damage or soot damage at the end of the weapon. To highlight the gun, once that Tenebrous Grey is dry, I just use a little bit of Sycorax bronze, it's a mouthful, from Warhammer, a little bit watered down, and I just do a highlight on that top leading edge that catches the light, and I just go around and catch the bottom edges of each of those little the sort of vent holes, just to give them a highlight. I only do this primarily on this bolt on this gun because it's not it's attached to his waist, so he's not used it in a while. The others, you'll notice we do a glowing effect coming from each of those vent holes, so there's not really a need to go and catch each of those bottom edges. But you can see now that we've got a nice highlighted gun with that soot effect at the end. So we've got like burn mark already happening because of that tenebrous grey. To paint the leather, I'm going for a sort of brightish leather of these guys, and we've got 4 colours there. The first colour we use is AK Afro Shadow, which is our darkest reddish brown, so Warhammer's Rhinox hide you could use for this. And this is basically just base coating now all of the leather on the miniature. Our first layer will be with AK Beast Brown, so we're covering probably 95%, leaving only in the recesses and in the shadowy areas the Afro Shadow. Then our first highlight is with the AK Deep Brown. So it's really an edge highlight and just picking out any scratches and any sort of little bits of wear and tear. And then our final highlight is with AK Cork, which is a very, very small edge highlight, really on the areas where you want to just show the mess wear and tear, like where the little pockets have been flapped up and down a little bit, just anywhere where you imagine the wear and tear is to be. But only a little bit of AK Cork is used towards the end. So what we've done is we've not had to do any washes because the Afro Shadow in the recesses acts as our darkest brown, and then we've worked up to our lightest brown. If you do get any of the colours into the shadows and the recesses, just go back over it with your darker colour. There isn't much gold on these guys, but anything you want to paint gold, just use a dark gold. I'm using AK Rusty Gold, and I just put a little bit of that over really the sort of over his sword or dagger. yeah, I think that was it really on the miniature for the gold. So just a little bit. For the wax seals and the parchments, I do the seals, I base them in violet red and then highlight them with AK magenta. For the highlights, I always just pick out the little, sometimes there's a little skull in the middle and obviously the little ridges around, so I just pick out a few points of those. For Warhammer colours, you're probably looking at sort of like a screamer pink and a pink horror, but any sort of the magenta purples. You can do wax seals in red, so you would just use a dark red and a light red. For the actual parchments themselves, I just base coat them in AK deck tan, then I do a wash of thinned out Reichland flesh shade, and then just go back over picking out any of the raised areas with the deck tan again. To highlight any of the black, so that would be sort of like the guns, any of the sort of plating on the guns, I use AK anthracite, which is a nice blue-grey, and I just really just edge highlight and just pick out any details here. I forgot whilst we were doing the metal to actually highlight it. So to highlight the silver, I use AK Natural Steel, which is a nice bright silver. And all I do here is just do subtle highlights, a couple of edge highlights, just where I imagine it would be brighter, picking out a few of the sort of details on the Aquila. And when you're working under a lamp, you can already see where the light is reflecting most with these true metallics. So I just paint a little bit of the silver, this natural steel, just over those areas, just to blend those in. So we're now just going to do some glowing effects, some heat effects. We're using these three colours first to get our basing done really for our glowing effects. So glowing effects work on the principle of contrast from dark, which is cold, to light, which is hot. So our darkest colour is AK Wine Red, and with this wine red we sort of base coat anything we want to have a glowing effect on. So I fill up the little vent holes at the top of the backpack, the exhaust at the back. So there's the sort of 4 exhausts, the 2 big ones. There's 8 really, the 2 big ones and the 4 little ones. And for the other Marines, obviously they've got helmets on and they're using their flamers. So I watered down a little bit of the wine red, just a little bit of water on the brush, and I fill in every single one of the vent holes. Bit of tedious work really, but it doesn't take too long. Just fill them all up with the wine red. And then I also paint the lenses with this wine red to get the glowing effect on his eyes. But to do that, this is our cold colour. So I paint not only the full lens itself, but a little bit of the area surrounding it, almost a sort of mascara, as it were. So I usually paint, it's like a rectangle from where the bottom of the lens is. Imagine the lens is an upside down triangle. I paint that entire section like a rectangle. So with the AK Blood Red, or you could use Warhammer Evil Sun Scarlet, I now paint the actual lens itself with this wine red, with the blood red, and I fill in all of the vent holes again with a watered down blood red, and I also fill in the bottom parts of those little vents and the sort of bottom third of the larger vents. Here I paint, pushing the paint downwards, remembering where you leave the brush the most paint is left, so we get a nice ridge of bright red on those bottom parts. And the sort of bottom half of these vents on the top I also put in blood red. So already we've got a glowing effect happening from our dark colour to our bright colour. Now for the white, which I use AK Intense White, I do a little dot in each of the lenses and a little dot in the bottom of each of the 5 vents at the top of the backpack, as I want the lenses and those to have our biggest sort of glowing effect coming from. And the reason we use white there is because the fluorescent paints work really well off of it. Now, excuse the bit of tape at the bottom of that pot. I pierced it with an airbrush pin needle by accident, but it's actually Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. And all I do here is put some on the brush. It's a bit like a thick contrast paint really. And now I just fill in all of the vent holes. And what it'll do when it dries, it will dry brighter on our bright points. I'll paint the entirety of the lens, and basically wherever we've put wine red and all the other colours, we paint that entire section again with this colour, just moving the paint downwards towards where we've got the white. But it's almost like a heavy glaze when applying this paint. Then with the AK Fluorescent Orange, which is next to it, I only use this subtly, and I do a little dot. Basically we paint over the white areas that we've done with the AK Fluorescent Orange. So wherever we've done the white dots, we just put a little bit of that fluorescent orange, and I just pick out a couple of the sort of vents on the flamer, just put a little bit of that fluorescent orange in those, just to show that some are a little bit hotter than others. So one big task is left to do, and that's always the joys of edge highlights. So I'm using AK Grass Green, which is a nice, very grassy green, very bright, and works quite well on these guys because it helps highlight where we've got the pistachio, where we've got the olive drab, where we've got the black green. This works well across all 3 of those colours. It doesn't look too bright or too dull on any of the others. Now, at its core here, all I'm doing is edge highlighting, but I'm also adding battle damage. So I'm adding scratches, bullet holes and marks. And where I've got slightly bigger bullet holes or scratches, once I've done this process, I then fill in some of those areas with a little bit of black, so it looks like the bullets or the scratches or the damage has gone right through to the core of the armour and has gone back to a sort of black colour. You could use like a reddish brown or rust colours, but I find on the Marines just going down to black is okay. On vehicles you can go to like rusty colours. As I said, the main goal here is to do edge highlighting, but I like to add in battle damage for 2 reasons. First off, I think it brings a bit of life and character to your models. Second reason is I do have a tendency of a twitchy right hand sometimes. So if it's twitchy, it's battle damage. So yeah, it helps out. I applied the transfers because they're quite big transfers. The Raptor symbol, I did have to use some decal softener. The one I use is listed in the description and at the end part, but any decal softener, it just helps soften the decal and remove the line around it as well, so it helps it form over those curved edges. Otherwise you have to snip them to get it to curve properly and it looks horrible. It also gives it a matte finish, so it looks like it's painted on, especially if you go over the top of it with some matte varnish as well. It really makes it look like you've painted it, and then we just do some battle damage and highlights over the top of it to blend it in with the model. But yeah, here we're just adding battle damage and then going back over it with some black just to make it look like it's beaten through into the base of the armour. So it's the longest process, but it's quite worth it, especially right across the whole unit. It really brings them together, makes your army stand out. Now the next step we're going to do is add a glowing effect where this guy hasn't got his helmet on. I wanted him to have a red glow coming from the sort of front part of the armour. And to do this, what I'm doing first is I'm just base coating the sort of front half of this neck part with AK intense white. So that'll be our most intense bright point. And then I'll grab the airbrush and use some Vallejo ink, just any white ink, and do a couple of sprays just to blend in the edges of that intense white around so we get a gradient. As I mentioned before, the white is the best colour when going over it with the fluorescence, really, because it's the sort of brightest colour, so you get the most bounce back of light from fluorescent paints when it's gone over white. With just your white ink, just a couple of short sharp sprays, just so you get a gradient from the intense white at the front down to a sort of greyish at the back. It's hard to see there on the camera because it sort of whites out a little bit, but there is a gradient there. Then once that's dry, put some fluorescent red into the airbrush and then just airbrush over all of that white, just taking care you don't get any over the other miniature. If you're nervous, then you could just use some masking tape or some airbrush putty. For my airbrush, it's nothing fancy. It's a £30 Fengder airbrush. It does what I need it to do. When it comes to painting the face, see, if you've not done the glowing effect, then I've painted my face with just Cadian flesh tone, then some Reikland flesh shade, and then highlight it with some Kislev flesh. If you wanted to get some bounce back lighting that we've got on this guy, then we just water down some AK blood red, and we just imagine, for me, whereas the light would be bouncing back off of his face and some of the stuff around his where his helmet would have been, like the vent hoses and stuff, and I just glaze this bright red colour over those areas so it shows that the light is bouncing back. I then add a little bit of fluorescent red, that we use that fleur red just to grab the intensity. But then to paint the face, I just use Cadian flesh tone with some Reikland flesh shade and highlighted it with Kislev flesh. Not much of a skin on this guy. But if you didn't have the glowing effect, you didn't want to do the red bounce back, then you maybe would want to base coat with Bugman's Glow and then do Cadian flesh tone and Kislev flesh. So the next section, and we know with that's the models painted really. It's just down to basing them. And for these guys, I wanted to have a sort of forest type base. So this is what I've ended up. This is for the sergeant. So he's got the most fancy stuff on his base. The other ones just have tufts. Otherwise, basing can become very expensive. So to achieve this, I just put a little bit of the Sterling mud, waited for it to dry, then did a sort of, I had a choice of two colours, medium olive or pistachio. So I base coated the base with some of the medium olive, but watered down, and then did a dry brushing of pistachio, so we get this kind of mossy, grassy type look. Then those 3D bits, so the mushroom is from Green Stuff World, and that was, the stem of the mushroom was AK Deck Tan with then some blood red. The ferns, which are from Epic Basing, they were base coated with the violet red and then highlighted with the AK magenta. So all of these colours are on the models already, so help blend in. The grass tufts are from Warpainter Scenics. And there's the little mushrooms from Green Stuff World. They do loads and loads of bits, and Epic Basing do loads of bits. They're easy to glue on. There's loads of detail on them. And as you can see, the normal guys have done exactly the same, but just added tufts instead. And then the sergeant, we've added some extra details just to there, make him stand out, and painted the rims in matte black. So yeah, basing is quite an individual thing, very personal, I find, in your miniatures. But that just might help showing you how you can do quick and easy foresty type bases that look really good, especially if you do a little couple of bits on the sergeants and then just generically do the other guys, so the squad blends in together but your sergeant really stands out. So I hope you've enjoyed this, what is for me a quick tutorial, just around an hour. The entire squad probably takes around 5 hours to paint, which is mostly used when you're doing your edge highlighting and battle damage. That does take a while. And again, you can create quite a cool looking Raptors army, which I'm quite tempted to do myself. So yeah, hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. Like, comment and subscribe, all those great YouTubey things. And yeah, happy painting, my fellow painters.